Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to examine an article by Susanna Rinard, Reasoning One's Way Out of Skepticism. This presents an interesting new argument against skepticism, specifically against skepticism about the external world. So first let's recall the basic case for external world skepticism. The skeptic introduces a skeptical hypothesis, such as the brain in a vat hypothesis. And she points out that all of your experiences could be just as they are now, even though you're a brain in a vat. So a sufficiently sophisticated vat computer system could generate the appearance that you have hands, when in fact you do not have hands. In order to know that you really do have hands, you would have to show that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false, but there's no way to do this. So you have an argument like this. If you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know that you have hands, you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know you have hands. And obviously there's a whole bunch of different skeptical hypotheses that you could choose here. I mean, the dreaming hypothesis, the evil demon hypothesis, etc. Now, it's worth outlining just a bit more what motivates these premises. So the motivation for the first premise, that if you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know you have hands, well, the thought is, look, the brain in a vat hypothesis is an alternative hypothesis, which is entirely consistent with all our evidence. In order to show that the common sense hypothesis is true, in order to show that I have hands, I would need to rule out alternative hypotheses on which it's false that I have hands. That's the basic thought there. What about the second premise, that you don't know you're not a brain in a vat? Well, Rinard frames the further argument here as follows. So she puts it like this. First, your basic evidence about the external world is restricted to propositions about the way the external world appears. Second, propositions about the way the external world appears are evidentially neutral between the common sense hypothesis and the brain in the vat hypothesis. And third, neither the common sense hypothesis nor the brain in the vat hypothesis is intrinsically more worthy of belief independently of one's evidence. I mean, after all, both of these hypotheses are consistent. God could have made the world in either of these ways. So we need evidence to decide which way it was actually made. But the result of all of these is, you don't have any reason to believe that the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. You don't know the brain in the vat hypothesis is false. Now, I should say, this is the way that Rinard frames it. I'm not so sure that skeptics would be committed to putting it in quite this way. I don't know if they'd be committed to putting it in terms of propositions, for instance. The key point is just that when I experience anything, say I have the visual experience as of having a pair of hands, well, an experience that is exactly identical to this from the inside, as it were, an experience that feels exactly the same to me, could instead be caused by something completely different. It could be caused by the electronic impulses produced by this very sophisticated vat. That's the sense in which the appearances are evidentially neutral between the common sense hypothesis and the brain in the vat hypothesis. So this is the classic argument for skepticism about the external world. How then should we respond to the skeptic? Well, broadly speaking, we can identify two sorts of projects that we might have when we're trying to give a response to the skeptic. And these are, there's the ambitious project and the more modest project. So an ambitious response attempts to convince the skeptic to change her mind. It attempts to argue against the skeptic on her own terms, and it doesn't presuppose anything that the skeptic calls into question. Modest responses, by contrast, only attempt to show where the skeptic goes wrong, but where you may rely on your ordinary beliefs in demonstrating this. So you may presuppose exactly those beliefs that the skeptic is calling into question when attempting to identify which premise of the skeptical argument to reject. So modest responses don't even attempt to convince the skeptic to change her mind. For example, if you are a reliabilist about knowledge, a reliabilist, you might argue, no, actually, you do know that you're not a brain in a vat. So you know that the second premise of the skeptical argument is false. You know you're not a brain in a vat, because on a reliabilist account of knowledge, to know that P involves holding a true belief that P, where this belief was produced by a reliable process, where it was produced by a process that tends to produce a good proportion of true beliefs to false beliefs. Now, it is in fact true that I'm not a brain in a vat, and this belief was in fact produced by a process that tends to deliver true beliefs, namely perception or something like that. At least perception is reliable, at least in certain situations. So the reliabilist will say, yeah, premise 2 of the skeptical argument, that's false. Now, obviously, that response is not going to convince the skeptic, because it presupposes the common sense hypothesis. It presupposes that perception is reliable, and that's just what the skeptic is calling into question. But what the reliabilist tries to do is she tries to show, for those of us who do accept the common sense hypothesis, for those of us who do take it that we have knowledge of the external world, where is it that the skeptical argument goes wrong? So that's a very modest response. You can check out my video on externalist responses to skepticism for more on this. Now, there are many philosophers who are doubtful that an ambitious response to skepticism is possible. They think that, look, once you've fallen into the skeptical rabbit hole, there's not really any way back out. All you can do is prevent others from falling in. Rinard aims to show that, no, we can give an ambitious response. She tries to show that even appealing only to premises that the external world skeptic accepts, we can show that you rationally ought to believe that external world skepticism is false. You ought not be an external world skeptic. So it's possible to reason one's way out of skepticism. Now, it's worth keeping in mind here that Rinard is concerned specifically with external world skepticism. There are, of course, more radical forms of skepticism which would urge us to suspend judgment not just about the external world, but about all beliefs. That includes beliefs about logic and mathematics, beliefs about one's own mind, beliefs about the correct epistemic principles. Everything is out. But radical skepticism is not Rinard's target. She's just talking about the skeptic of the external world. It's also worth being clear at the outset that Rinard's aim here is actually quite limited. She's only trying to show that it's possible for an external world skeptic to reason her way out of skepticism. In principle, her own argument that she's going to give doesn't really need to be correct. It doesn't need to be sound in order to demonstrate that possibility. So that's just something worth keeping in mind when we go through the objections to her argument. I'll come back to this point later. But anyway, with that said as background, we can turn now to Rinard's argument. So she's going to argue that it is irrational to accept external world skepticism. Right then, so we begin with this proposition. If it is rational to accept external world skepticism, then it is rational to accept skepticism about the past. And this is because the argument that we just saw against beliefs about the external world applies equally to any beliefs about the past. You can construct an exactly parallel argument with respect to beliefs about the past. So consider the hypothesis that you are a brain in a vat, but that you've been in existence only for 5 seconds. All of your memories, all of your apparent memories further back than 5 seconds have been implanted. And of course, I suppose, if you imagine yourself as an evil neuroscientist who's trying to create brains in vats for some reason, then you might well think, well, wouldn't it be easier instead of like making a brain in a vat over a whole lifetime? Maybe it's easier to just make a brain in a vat that exists for like a minute, and then you just implant false memories, rather than running the experiment over decades. Just do it for 1 minute and put some false memories in there. So anyway, we'll call this the no past brain in a vat hypothesis. And there are similar hypotheses you could use here. I mean, you might consider the hypothesis that you are a Boltzmann brain, for instance. But anyway, now you just take the original argument for external world skepticism and we replace instances of external world with the past, and we replace instances of brain in a vat with no past brain in a vat. And so we can say, look, your basic evidence about the past is restricted to propositions about the way the past appears. And the way the past appears here is, of course, memories. You seem to remember things being a certain way. Propositions about the way the past appears are evidentially neutral between the common sense hypothesis and the no past brain in a vat hypothesis. And third, neither the common sense hypothesis nor the no past brain in a vat hypothesis is intrinsically more worthy of belief independently of one's evidence. So you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat that has only existed for 5 seconds. And then, of course, per the basic skeptical argument, you're just not going to know any propositions about the past. If you don't know that you're not such a brain in a vat, you don't know that, you were thinking about philosophy 10 seconds ago. Now, if you accept the original argument for external world skepticism, surely you should also accept this argument. To do otherwise would be unreasonably arbitrary. There is no relevant difference between any of the premises of these arguments. It's worth noting at this point, Rinard doesn't actually elaborate on why this kind of arbitrariness is a problem, and we will come back to this. But anyway, this is the idea, right? It's just completely arbitrary to endorse that original argument, but not this argument. So if you're an external world skeptic, you rationally ought to be a skeptic about the past. Okay then, next premise. If it is rational to accept skepticism about the past, then it's rational to accept the argument from skepticism about the past to skepticism of complex reasoning. Okay, complex reasoning is reasoning that involves multiple steps that cannot be held in one's mind all at once. Many philosophical arguments, many proofs in mathematics and logic, many scientific inferences, all involve complex reasoning in this sense. We are able to consciously grasp, at any given time, only a few premises and their inferential relations. I mean, only a few at best. So, like, if I begin with, premise 1, then I reason to premise 2, then to premise 3, all the way to, conclusion number 10, well, I'm not going to consciously grasp all of the steps from 1 to 10, right? I might only consciously grasp the step from 9 to 10 while merely seeming to remember having reasoned my way, from 1 to 9. Skepticism about complex reasoning is the view that you cannot know any proposition on the basis of complex reasoning. And Rinard argues that skepticism about the past entails skepticism of complex reasoning. Now, the point here is fairly simple. So take some proposition P, which is the conclusion of a complex argument. I go through the argument for P. I eventually arrive at the conclusion, P. But by the time I arrive at that conclusion, I no longer consciously grasp all of the premises leading to that conclusion. I only have the apparent memory of having worked through those premises. But according to skepticism about the past, I have no justification for trusting any of my apparent memories. For all I know, I came into existence 5 seconds ago. So I may have the false memory of having given this, compelling argument, but that's it. If skepticism about the past is true, I cannot come to know anything by giving a complex argument for it. Now, of course, you might think, okay, well, maybe there's sort of ways you could kind of build a complex argument into the present moment. I mean, what about, for instance, what about subconscious reasoning? It seems, perhaps plausible there are subconscious thoughts. Perhaps what happens when you go through a 10-premise argument is that you hold the last step consciously while the earlier steps are held subconsciously. Well, I mean, perhaps that is logically consistent with your current experience. The problem is, all that the skeptic needs is that, look, the no past hypothesis is also consistent with your current experience, and maybe your feeling of seeming to remember the first steps is, so maybe it's true that the feeling of seeming to remember those first steps is you're currently doing those steps subconsciously, but maybe your feeling of seeming to remember those steps is just a false memory implanted into your brain and nothing's happening subconsciously. Your current experience doesn't tell you either way, right? So that's all the skeptic needs, is that it is consistent with your experience that you are a brain in a vat that was made 5 seconds ago, and that there just are no subconscious thoughts, and so there's actually just nothing that support that there is no way in which you have gone through this complex argument. So skepticism about the past is going to entail skepticism of complex reasoning. But it is not rational to accept the argument from skepticism about the past to skepticism of complex reasoning. Why? Well, the argument just presented from skepticism about the past to skepticism of complex reasoning is itself a complex argument. You cannot consciously grasp all at one time each step of the argument and how those steps support the conclusion. So the argument is self-defeating. Suppose I were to accept complex reasoning on the basis of this argument. As soon as I accept that conclusion, I'm going to see that the argument itself, the argument for complex reasoning skepticism, is complex. I see that I do not have all the steps of the argument clearly in my mind all at one time. If I accept complex reasoning skepticism on the basis of complex reasoning, my belief in complex reasoning skepticism is, according to myself, not rational. And it does seem, it seems like we might expect that any argument for complex reasoning skepticism is going to be a complex argument, because complex reasoning skepticism is a very surprising claim. It's not the sort of thing that we could plausibly take as a basic belief that does not require justification. It's not like, 1 + 1 = 1, right? It's surprising. It's also not the sort of thing that just obviously follows from premises that we're all inclined to accept naturally. It's not just an obvious entailment of certain other obvious things. So any path to complex reasoning skepticism looks like it's going to be complex and thereby self-defeating. Now, of course, it is worth noting that neither external world skepticism nor skepticism about the past in themselves are going to have any commitment to how long the present moment is. And if the present moment is long enough, then you're going to be able to fit any amount of reasoning at all in it. So here's a point at which a skeptic could reject Rinard's argument. We might say, no, maybe the present moment is just much longer than we think, or there's just more contained within the present moment than we initially think. But of course, we should keep in mind here that Rinard is only targeting external world skepticism, and many external world skeptics are going to accept common sense claims about phenomenology. So they're going to accept sort of common sense ideas about what the present moment is, how long the present moment is. And I guess, Rinard could also just put the point like this. Like, if you think that you can just work through, 5 premises in just a single instant, well, go on then, just do it. Just try it. Just try to hold all of that in your mind all at once. You're probably going to be disappointed. So, if you really think you can do it, well, maybe this argument isn't going to apply to you, but most of us think we can't do it. So anyway, skepticism about the past leads to complex reasoning skepticism. Complex reasoning skepticism is self-defeating. Now, the underlying principle that she's relying on in this part is what she calls the anti-denouncement principle. So according to this principle, it is not rational to believe that P, while also believing that it is not rational to believe that P. So in other words, if you take the conjunction of beliefs, P and it is not rational to believe that P, holding that conjunction of beliefs is not rational. Basically, it's not rational to hold a belief that I myself take to be irrational. Rinard illustrates this principle with the following kind of case. Suppose that you are considering whether to invest your savings in the stock market. You think that this is a safe bet only if the market will have an average annual return of at least 8% over the next few decades. Suppose then that you investigate the relevant evidence and you conclude, no, it would not be rational to believe the market will return at least 8%. The evidence just does not support this. But despite this, you just decide to believe that it will return at least 8%, and so you invest your savings anyway. Well, that seems clearly irrational. If anything is irrational, surely this is irrational. This seems like a paradigmatic case of irrationality. Well, similarly, by accepting an argument for complex reasoning skepticism, you put yourself in a position where you simultaneously believe that P, namely, you believe complex reasoning skepticism, you accept that, but you also believe that it is not rational to believe that P, because you don't have any rational case for complex reasoning skepticism. So this violates the anti-denouncement principle, and so yeah, that's basically the argument, and we can kind of lay out the whole argument like this. If it is rational to accept external world skepticism, then it is rational to accept skepticism about the past. If it's rational to accept skepticism about the past, then it's rational to accept the argument from skepticism about the past to complex reasoning skepticism. It is not rational to accept the argument from skepticism about the past to complex reasoning skepticism, so it is not rational to accept external world skepticism. Okay, so far what we have shown is that accepting external world skepticism is irrational, because external world skepticism, it turns out, is self-defeating. Now, Rinard does argue for some further claims. She argues that first, it is not rational to suspend judgment about external world skepticism, and then secondly, that it is rational to disbelieve external world skepticism. Those claims are, of course, subtly different from the claim that it is not rational to accept external world skepticism. I'm not going to examine these further steps in the video, in this video. Instead, what I want to do is turn to some challenges to her argument against accepting external world skepticism. I think this really is the key part of Rinard's argument, and if this part of Rinard's argument succeeds, that is in itself a significant result. On the other hand, if it fails, then her further arguments are already going to be undermined. So I mean, this really is, I think, the heart of Rinard's paper. But I just first of all want to note a sort of consequence of the argument so far. Rinard would probably grant that if skepticism includes skepticism of complex reasoning, then the ambitious response is off the table. In principle, the skeptic of complex reasoning is going to reject any complex argument for any proposition. But we know that an argument against skepticism is going to be a complex argument. I mean, some anti-skeptical arguments might seem simple in how they are initially stated. So, you take Moore's argument that, here's a hand, so, look, there's at least one external object, so there is an external world. That seems like a simple argument, but those arguments always require further elaboration in a way that takes them into complex territory. And, of course, moreover, if you are a skeptic of complex reasoning, then it's not really, are you likely to be convinced there's anything problematic about self-defeat? Well, probably not. Still, I mean, the key thing is, look, we may provide ambitious responses to more limited forms of skepticism. The external world skeptic assumes certain epistemic principles and is willing to be swayed by argument. So what Rinard is trying to do is, provide an ambitious response to external world skepticism specifically, while granting that more radical forms of skepticism may be unassailable on their own terms. But those radical forms of skepticism are just as unpalatable to the external world skeptic as they are to the rest of us. The external world skeptic doesn't want to give up complex reasoning. She doesn't want to give up the principle that it's irrational to reject self-defeating theories and so on. The principle that it's irrational to accept self-defeating theories, and so on. Okay then, so with all that said then, let's turn to an advert, a quick advert. So I have a Patreon, which has a whole bunch of bonus videos, so if you want to see more of me, then you can sign up to the Patreon and you can get access to bonus videos there. I mean, there must be hundreds up by now. It's been going for quite a while, so there's a lot of content on there. Or you could just send me some cash on PayPal. Obviously, I really appreciate any support you can give, even if that's just a matter of commenting on the video and giving the video a like or whatever. Any kind of engagement would be good. Also, I made these shirts, and I still have some shirts available. So, if you want a Cane B shirt, then, you can go check that out. They are limited. I started with just 10 of each, and they are now going down in number. So these ones were some shirts based on the previous video I did on veganism. So anyway, yeah, you can check that out too, and the links for all that stuff will be in the description. All right then, let's turn to some objections to Rinard's argument. So the first objection is what I'm calling the further argument challenge. So let's suppose that self-defeat is a problem, right? We're agreeing with Rinard that self-defeat is a problem. Then, of course, for whatever form of skepticism is self-defeating, we have a reason to reject it, and we have a reason to reject any arguments that would lead to that form of skepticism. So let's say that we have an argument for external world skepticism. Call this argument S. S might as well just be the argument that we saw at the beginning of this video. S is the argument for external world skepticism. Rinard's idea is that from S, we can give a further argument, S star, which leads to skepticism of complex reasoning. And it's important to see that merely holding external world skepticism doesn't in itself make you skeptical of complex reasoning, right? You need an argument to show how one of those leads to the other, and that's what S star provides. So S star is this kind of linking argument from external world skepticism to skepticism of complex reasoning. Basically we have S, which takes us to external world skepticism, and then we have S star, which takes us from external world skepticism to skepticism of complex reasoning. So S star takes us to the self-defeating conclusion. But at that point, why shouldn't the external world skeptic say, well, look, since complex reasoning skepticism is in itself self-defeating, we have a reason to reject S star that doesn't hold for S. So there is a problem for S star that is not a problem for S. It's not S in itself that gets us self-defeat, it's S star. So if self-defeat is a problem, we should reject S star, but that's not going to be a reason to reject S, so external world skepticism is unscathed. Basically, the challenge here is that there is a further argument from external world skepticism to skepticism of complex reasoning, and we might take self-defeat to be a problem for that specific further argument, not for the original argument for external world skepticism. Crucially, what you have to keep in mind here is Rinard never claims, and there's a good reason she never claims this, Rinard never claims that external world skepticism logically entails skepticism of complex reasoning. Because it doesn't logically entail that. It doesn't logically entail skepticism about the past, right? So you go through this stage where it's like external world skepticism, then skepticism about the past, then complex reasoning skepticism, right? External world skepticism doesn't logically entail skepticism about the past. Rinard's point is the argument for external world skepticism is paralleled by an argument for skepticism about the past. And then she claims, it would be arbitrary to endorse the argument for external world skepticism while rejecting the argument for skepticism about the past. That's just arbitrary. But now we might object, well, actually this isn't arbitrary, because we now have a symmetry breaker. The symmetry breaker is the argument for skepticism about the past is self-defeating, but the argument for external world skepticism is not. So look, I have a reason to reject this argument that I didn't have for the argument for external world skepticism. So basically, I think, so what's going on here is when I reflect on skeptical scenarios, that might lead me to be skeptical of the external world. I might then see that a similar argument leads to skepticism about the past, and then skepticism of complex reasoning. But then I notice skepticism of complex reasoning is self-defeating. So that's gonna block the argument for skepticism of complex reasoning, but it doesn't obviously help to block the initial argument for skepticism of the external world. I guess one way to think about this is that, if Rinard's argument is successful, it shows, well, we can't accept skepticism of complex reasoning, but we could block the move to skepticism of complex reasoning at any point. We might block it where Rinard suggests we block it, which is before we arrive at skepticism of the external world. But, we might block it further up the chain, right before we arrive at skepticism of complex reasoning. Or we could block it much further down the chain. We could reject, epistemic principles, more generally or something, right? We don't even... I'll come back to this point, but we might not even, accept the kind of like underdetermination style argument that the external world skeptic is using. But in any case, I think the external world skeptic could say here, well, actually, contrary to what Rinard says, it's not arbitrary for me to just reject this argument for skepticism about the past, because there's a symmetry breaker, and that symmetry breaker is self-defeat. Now, one way we might be tempted to respond is we might be tempted to respond like this. We might say, look, it's not enough just to say that S star leads to a position that is self-defeating. After all, what S star is claiming to do is take us from S, which you accept, to the self-defeating conclusion. So if you're going to accept S, but then reject S star on the grounds that it leads to a self-defeating conclusion, you need to pinpoint where S star goes wrong. You need to tell us, like, well, which premise is false, which inference rule is invalid. But I think here, the external world skeptic can say, look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Rinard, she's also going to need to show us where exactly the argument for external world skepticism goes wrong, where this involves more than just showing that it leads to a self-defeating position. And basically, if it's enough for Rinard to reject S merely on the grounds that S leads to a self-defeating position, without telling us exactly where this argument goes wrong, well, then I can reject her argument S star on the same grounds. I can reject whatever argument has led from external world skepticism to the self-defeating position merely on the grounds that to accept it would be self-defeating. That's what she does with the external world skeptical argument itself. If the point is that, well, when you accept S and you reject S star, you need a symmetry breaker, Rinard has already provided the symmetry breaker. S star is self-defeating, S is not. So yeah, this is one kind of worry that Rinard is relying on a sort of further argument, and once you put that further argument forward, the external world skeptic is just going to be able to resist that in the way I've suggested. Here's a second worry. I mentioned that we might block the reasoning that leads to the self-defeating position much further up the chain, calling into question epistemic principles beyond their specific application in the argument for external world skepticism. Well, here's a specific example. So the way that Rinard presents the basic skeptical argument is that it is a kind of underdetermination argument. It appeals to underdetermination with respect to the causes of experience. So, obviously the idea is, look, the way that things appear is compatible with many different hypotheses about what's causing those appearances. That's the basic idea. But underdetermination like this occurs in many contexts, and it's often taken to have epistemic significance. So it occurs, for instance, in quantum mechanics. And we might wonder, well, does this also put us on the slippery slope towards complex reasoning skepticism? And if not, why not? So suppose that Verity endorses the Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, and I object to her. I say, look, you don't know that the many worlds interpretation is false. And if you don't know that the many worlds interpretation is false, you don't know that the Bohmian interpretation is true. So actually, you don't know the Bohmian interpretation is true. And, in defense of my claim that she doesn't know many worlds is false, I might say, your basic evidence about quantum mechanics is restricted to propositions about the results of physical experiments. Propositions about the results of physical experiments are evidentially neutral between Bohm and many worlds. Neither Bohm nor many worlds is intrinsically more worthy of belief independently of one's evidence. So you don't know that many worlds is false. Now, look, whether this is the best representation of the dialectic is, of course, open to question, but I think something along these lines is persuasive to many people. The thing is, look, for many of us, it seems reasonable to suspend judgment about the interpretation of quantum mechanics, because the relevant data, the data that we have, just doesn't decide between these multiple theories. And if all the physical experiments are compatible with each interpretation, and if there's no serious intrinsic problem with any interpretation, if as long as there's no like logical inconsistency or whatever, well, then we just have no way of knowing which one is right. I think it's worth noting, by the way, that when people who favour a particular interpretation defend it, they don't defend it by just rejecting this kind of underdetermination style reasoning in general. Rather, they basically argue against Q3. What they'll say is, no, there are certain interpretations that are more intrinsically worthy of belief. So maybe the many worlds interpretation is simpler, right? Because it's simpler, it's more intrinsically worthy of belief, right? So they'll appeal to explanatory virtues or whatever. But this basic kind of argument, this sort of underdetermination style argument, does seem to be an important part of our epistemic toolkit, and that's exactly the same kind of argument the skeptic makes about the external world. So we might wonder, are we required to reject underdetermination arguments in general because these arguments lead to skepticism about the past? I mean, the case of quantum mechanics is just one among many examples of this. So for a more everyday example, let's say I'm looking out at the ocean, I see a ship on the ocean, but it's very far away. It's just a sort of, black smudge, a small black smudge that I see. Well, the evidence doesn't tell me whether this is a cruise ship or a battleship. What I see is compatible with both cases. My visual experience doesn't decide between those cases. So neither the proposition that it's a cruise ship nor the proposition that it's a battleship is supported, is favoured by the evidence. Moreover, neither proposition is intrinsically more worthy of belief. Either of them could be true. So I should suspend judgment. I shouldn't believe either. Now you might say, well, there's some relevant difference between these underdetermination arguments and the skeptical argument. I mean, maybe it is acceptable to run underdetermination arguments in what you might call local cases, where we might in principle gather further evidence to decide between the competing hypotheses. But perhaps underdetermination reasoning becomes illegitimate when it's applied globally to one's total experience. So think about, for instance, there's like hinge epistemologists who reject the idea of doing a sort of global assessment of one's experience. You can make those kinds of moves here, but we might worry that if Rinard is going to take this line, then it's going to make her self-defeat argument superfluous. Because if you take this line, then what you should say is that the problem with external world skepticism isn't so much that it leads to self-defeat, it's just that it applies underdetermination reasoning in an illegitimate way. The skeptic tries to do this kind of global assessment of experience in a way that is illegitimate. And so, that would be the way to reason yourself out of skepticism, and not the way that Rinard suggests. All right, a third objection. A third objection involves a kind of anti-Moorean shift argument. So for more on the Moorean shift, on the original Moorean shift, you can check out my video on Moore's argument against skepticism. But this is a sort of anti-Moorean shift because it's in the skeptic's favour. So remember that Rinard, she does not try to show where exactly the skeptical argument goes wrong. Right? She doesn't try to identify which premise is false or which inference rule is invalid. Her strategy, instead, is to show, well, it entails a self-defeating position, which is, that's fair enough, right? You don't necessarily have to show where exactly an argument goes wrong. If we can show that external world skepticism entails skepticism of complex reasoning, then, we've shown it's self-defeating. And since no self-defeating position could be correct, we now know that any argument for external world skepticism must be flawed, even if we can't identify exactly where that flaw is. But what we should notice now is that we have kind of two arguments on the table, right? So on the one hand we have S, which is a seemingly compelling argument for external world skepticism, and on the other hand we have S star, which is a seemingly compelling argument that S entails a self-defeating position. Rinard, of course, she accepts S star, and then she uses that to target S. But why not just go in the other direction? why not accept S and then use that to target S star? So that is, why not say this? Look, I affirm the argument for external world skepticism. And since the correct position can't be self-defeating, since I have a compelling argument that external world skepticism is right, I have an argument that external world skepticism is not self-defeating. Now, of course, yeah, I may not be able to identify exactly where Rinard's argument goes wrong, right? I don't know exactly where it goes wrong. I don't know which premise is false or which inference rule is invalid, but I know it goes wrong somewhere. Why shouldn't the external world skeptics say this? I mean, this mirrors what Rinard says about the external world skeptics argument. So if it's okay for her to just dismiss their argument on those grounds, well, why wouldn't it be okay for the external world skeptic to respond like this? I should note, by the way, that arguably there might actually be positive reasons to prefer this move. There might be reasons to prefer using S to target S star rather than using target S star to target S. First of all, it could be that you find the premises of S just more intuitively plausible than the premises of S star. I mean, for what it's worth, that actually is my own intuition. I find the premises of the argument for external world skepticism they're just very attractive. To me, they actually almost are items of common sense. It seems very intuitively plausible, very intuitive argument. Now, Rinard's premises are plausible too, but somewhat less so. So, I mean, if you're going to sort of look at this just in terms of, well, it's sort of weighing up these different premises and just asking which are more attractive, and we're kind of going with our intuitions, as philosophers often do, then you might say, there's reasons to kind of go for the sort of using the argument S and taking that one and accepting that, and then using that to target S star. A second point is that, as suggested by the previous objection I talked about, it may be that Rinard's argument is going to force us to reject plausible epistemic principles beyond just those that are used in the premises of skeptical arguments. So it may be that Rinard's argument, kind of generalizes beyond just skeptical arguments in particular. So if we find that, underdetermination reasoning in general is threatened by Rinard's strategy, then that's going to give us some further reason to doubt that the strategy works, because giving up underdetermination reasoning would mean a pretty serious change to our reasoning practices, or so it seems. So yes, this may be another line that the skeptic could take. All right, a fourth objection is what I'm calling the which anchor problem. So, if Rinard's argument is successful, what it shows is that we need some sort of anchor. So external world skepticism leads to memory skepticism leads to skepticism of complex reasoning, etc. So we can't be external world skeptics, right? We have to, we have to believe in the external world, right? We have to put an anchor down, believe in the external world. But which external world? Which external world should we believe in? Because there are many options here. I mean, suppose that I reject the common sense hypothesis and I instead accept something that would normally be considered a skeptical scenario, right? I mean, there's many options here. So it might be that I believe that the common sense world is a dream world, and that I'm convinced that instead that reality is revealed by a DMT trip. Or it might be that I'm convinced I'm in a computer simulation, or that I'm a Boltzmann brain, or whatever. I mean, it's possible to propose these not as mere skeptical scenarios, but as serious hypotheses that we might have reason to believe. People who take DMT often report that the experiences seem more veridical than ordinary perception. So, they have some reason to think that, okay, maybe the DMT world is the real world, and, ordinary perception is just, hallucination. The simulation hypothesis is outright defended by some philosophers. Boltzmann brains follow from certain physical theories. Arguments for a godlike entity combined with metaphysical pessimism might lead a person to accept something like an evil demon hypothesis. So there are these positive reasons to actually favour some of these scenarios. Or maybe, maybe I have no reason at all, and I'm just intuitively inclined to accept one of these hypotheses over the common sense hypothesis. But the key thing is, my starting point is then something that conventionally would be seen as a skeptical scenario. So, suppose I'm convinced by Rinard's argument, I come to the discussion with the belief that the DMT world is the real world. Well, clearly Rinard's argument is going to do nothing to convince me that I must accept the common sense hypothesis. Of course, from the point of view of the common sense hypothesis, the DMT hypothesis is a skeptical hypothesis. Ordinary perception is totally untrustworthy and deceptive. The DMT perception is what's privileged. But of course, if you accept the DMT hypothesis, that's not to say that you're skeptical of perception in general. All of us agree that perception is misleading in certain conditions. Rinard would no doubt have that view of DMT. She would say that what you seem to perceive when you're taking DMT is deceptive. It's a hallucination of some sort. So the question is, well, why favour the common sense hypothesis as a starting point? Why should that be, the anchor? What counts as a skeptical hypothesis is going to be, it's sort of partly a function of your background beliefs, right? And it's not clear why we should take the common sense hypothesis as being what anchors us. Incidentally, it's worth noting that in this specific case of taking the DMT world to be the real world, we're not obviously led to skepticism about the past, because you may well take your memories within the DMT world to be accurate. At least assuming that there is actually experiences that correspond to the standard distinction between perception and memory. Maybe maybe when people take DMT, those the boundaries start to become much more fuzzy than usual. But the point is just, in principle, there could be a drug that creates lots of hallucinations and so on, but that doesn't really in any way challenge one's memory. So you're not going to go to your reason for taking that world seriously is not going to be a reason to think that all memories are false. But anyway, the point is just, look, whatever, there are many ways I can start, right? There are many starting points I can have, and nothing is going to favour the common sense hypothesis here. Now, Rinard might well just be sanguine about all of this, because all she is trying to do is attack external world skepticism. And if we accept some crazy alternative to the common sense hypothesis, we're not external world skeptics. A skeptic is somebody who suspends judgment. A skeptic says, I don't know what's going on. If you actually accept one of these scenarios, then it's not really a skeptical scenario anymore. It's just an alternative theory about what the world is like beyond our experiences. You are claiming to know what is going on. And so, Rinard might say that her goal is not to establish the common sense hypothesis over any specific hypothesis. It's just to show that the underdetermination argument for skepticism doesn't work. But I think there are two worries about this move. So the first worry is that in the context of a discussion about skepticism, this does kind of seem like a Pyrrhic victory, right? Because if I accept the DMT hypothesis or the evil demon hypothesis or whatever, I am going to hold that almost all of our beliefs about the external world, all of our ordinary beliefs about the external world, are false. You do not know that you have hands. You don't know that there are other people with minds like yours. You don't know that the Earth orbits the Sun, and so on. Almost all of our everyday, personal, scientific knowledge is undermined. And, if I accept, this hypothesis, then I can use Rinard. I can just as legitimately use Rinard's argument as can you. Indeed, what's worse, I can use her argument to dismiss whatever worry the common sense hypothesis is supposed to pose to my worldview. So, just as the person who accepts the common sense hypothesis can use Rinard's argument to dismiss the challenge to the common sense hypothesis that is raised by skeptical scenarios, so I, the person who accepts the DMT hypothesis, can use Rinard's argument to dismiss the challenge to my worldview that might be raised by the common sense hypothesis as an alternative possibility. I can just apply her argument and say, well, look, I can't take look if I start taking the common sense hypothesis seriously, then that's going to lead me to skepticism, to external world skepticism. If I start suspending judgment about DMT versus common sense, then I'm going to become an external world skeptic, and we can't have that, because that'll lead me to a position that's self-defeating. So that's one point. The second point, I think, more importantly, is that I think there's a worry here that Rinard's own argument is going to turn out to be self-defeating. So let's be clear about the situation here, right? Let's say that I'm an ordinary person. I start out with the common sense hypothesis, but then, I encounter the hypothesis of the DMT world. And, maybe I encounter it directly via experience with this drug, or maybe it's just by testimony from others. And then I ask myself, okay, which hypothesis do I accept, right? And I find I just don't really have anything that decides between, the common sense hypothesis and the DMT hypothesis. Nothing favours one or the other. Because, the idea that the world is as it seems, and the idea that actually this is just a hallucination being created by weird geometrical aliens that are revealed by DMT, those hypotheses are just both entirely consistent with my experiences. So I suspend judgment, right? Now, notice that Rinard's argument gives me absolutely nothing to say to a person who believes the DMT hypothesis. It gives me nothing to say to a person who actually accepts that hypothesis and takes that as her starting point. And again, I notice nothing in my experience rules out the DMT hypothesis, and so it's a short step to ask myself, well, why shouldn't I take this seriously? And as soon as I entertain that hypothesis, because I have nothing that favours the common sense hypothesis over it, I'm going to find myself in a state of skepticism. And if Rinard's argument gives me nothing to say to, my interlocutor that should push her towards the common sense hypothesis, right? It doesn't give me anything to say to somebody who actively accepts the DMT hypothesis. Well, similarly, it doesn't seem to give me anything to say to myself that should push me to the common sense hypothesis. So, the person who accepts the DMT hypothesis has no reason to move over to the common sense hypothesis. But similarly, if I'm just kind of undecided between these two hypotheses, it doesn't look like I have anything from Rinard's argument that should push me towards the common sense hypothesis. So, what do I do, right? What should I do in this situation? Do I flip a coin? If Rinard is right, then I need some sort of anchor, right? I need to accept one hypothesis or another, but I have nothing that favours one or the other. So what do? Do I flip a coin? I have to choose one hypothesis over another, but it's hard to see how I could take myself to have any rational justification for choosing the common sense hypothesis, or the DMT hypothesis for that matter. But now remember the anti-denouncement principle that Rinard used in her critique of complex reasoning skepticism. It is not rational to believe that P, while also believing that it is not rational to believe that P. As far as I can tell, I have no rational justification for favouring one hypothesis over another. So to form a belief either way would not be rational. Yet Rinard's argument tells me I have to believe one of those hypotheses over the other anyway, because skepticism isn't rational. So I think there's a dilemma here for Rinard. Suppose that anti-denouncement is true. Well, then in the absence of some independent argument one way or the other, it would not be rational for me to form a belief in either the common sense hypothesis or the DMT hypothesis, or for that matter, a whole bunch of other skeptical hypotheses. Rinard's self-defeat argument alone is powerless to move me here, because it doesn't in itself provide any reason for either hypothesis. So, it now looks like I'm just still in this state of skepticism, right? On the other hand, suppose that anti-denouncement is not true. Well, then Rinard's case against complex reasoning skepticism just collapses, right? It may be perfectly rational for me to accept the argument for complex reasoning skepticism while also believing that it is irrational to accept the argument for complex reasoning skepticism. Skepticism here will no longer be self-defeating by its own lights. And I mean, this point, by the way, I think also supports the kind of anti-Moorean shift that I noted in the third objection. The premises for the external world skeptical argument may be more plausible than the premises of Rinard's argument. And here we now see an outright problematic consequence of Rinard's argument. I mean, it's a consequence that I think she herself would regard as problematic, because it's self-defeat. It's exactly the kind of thing that she's accusing the skeptic of. So, you know, I mean, this seems like a bit of a concern. I mean, I think what all of this shows is that an ambitious response to skepticism needs to do more than just show that we need an anchor, right? It also has to tell us which anchor to choose. So it's not enough to show that it is irrational to suspend judgment about the external world. We also need to show that it is rational to believe some hypothesis or other, and Rinard doesn't show that. Indeed, her own argument seems to show that given our circumstances, it's irrational to believe some hypothesis or other. I think something to keep in mind here is that even if we did establish the irrationality of suspending judgment, that doesn't in itself show that it is irrational to believe any particular hypothesis. Because maybe it just turns out that nothing is rational. Maybe no option is rational. Maybe we cannot rationally suspend judgment, but at the same time we cannot rationally believe any particular hypothesis either. That would be an unfortunate result for the theory of rationality, but maybe that's where the argument leads. I mean, it's kind of analogous to how in the moral domain, sometimes it might be argued that sometimes there are just these genuine moral dilemmas where, you know, you end up in a situation where, you know, there is nothing that you ought to do. You know, there is nothing that you are morally permitted to do, right? So no matter what action you take, you're going to be doing something that you ought not to do, morally speaking. Well, here the idea is that, look, no matter how you organize your beliefs, maybe there's just like no way of doing that rationally. You're going to be believing in some way that you ought not to be believing. It seems like, you know, maybe things could turn out that way. And so, yeah, that seems to be where we are, right? It's just not enough to show that it's irrational to suspend judgment. We got to show that it's also rational to hold a particular belief. Okay, so I have considered some ways that the external world skeptic might resist Rinard's argument. But, you know, Rinard might object that all of this is actually just irrelevant to what she's trying to do. Because, as I noted earlier, she only aims to show that it is possible that we can reason our way out of external world skepticism. It's possible that we can present arguments to an external world skeptic which appeal to premises that the external world skeptic accepts and which conclude that external world skepticism is irrational. Now, such arguments need not appeal to premises that are unassailable. I mean, any premise can be questioned by some philosopher or other, right? So it doesn't really matter that we're able to find objections to Rinard's argument. The point is just that the premises of Rinard's argument are, firstly, plausible in some way, and secondly, could be accepted by an external world skeptic. And then such an external world skeptic would then be able to rationally reason their way out of skepticism. Actually, I'm not sure that they would be able to do that, because if we go back to the fourth objection, what that tried to show is that, the which anchor objection, that tried to show that Rinard's principles don't actually allow the skeptic to reason her way out of her skepticism. But put that to one side. If all Rinard is trying to do is show that it is possible for an external world skeptic to be convinced by an argument, we might wonder whether that's really an interesting conclusion. So, I mean, yeah, there are many philosophers who say that skepticism is sort of resistant to counter-arguments in some way. Once we're convinced of skepticism, we're stuck forever. Maybe that's true of radical skepticism, but I think when it comes to external world skepticism, we really have plenty of examples of arguments that aim to sort of reason you out of external world skepticism. I mean, isn't that what Descartes already did, right? Like, so, Descartes kind of applies methodological doubt, right? So he calls into question, all of his beliefs, and then he finds an indubitable proposition. But the indubitable proposition that he finds is a proposition about just his own mind, right? He initially, right, in the early stage of his argument, the external world is not involved in any way. He just has this proposition about his own mind. That's it. So he is in a radically skeptical situation here, where maybe he knows something about his own mind, he doesn't know anything about the external world. But then what does he do? Well, he reasons his way out of this skepticism to various propositions about the external world. Now, maybe Descartes' argument isn't convincing, but similar. Yeah, we can simply say, well, there's many reasons to think that Rinard's argument isn't convincing, right? Like, if all we need to do is illustrate the possibility of reasoning your way out of external world skepticism, then I don't know, why doesn't Descartes' argument count as illustrating that possibility? It does. Descartes' not a complete idiot, right? He appeals to premises that have some plausibility, and he appeals to premises that an external world skeptic could accept. Consider also, for a more modern example, there are many philosophers who respond to external world skepticism by denying the premise that neither the common sense hypothesis nor the brain in the vat hypothesis is intrinsically more worthy of belief independent of one's evidence. So here we can appeal to inference to the best explanation. We can argue, look, the common sense hypothesis scores much better on explanatory virtues such as simplicity. Simplicity is a guide to truth. Simpler explanation is a better explanation, and we should believe the best explanation is true, and the common sense hypothesis is the simplest available explanation. So in principle, an external world skeptic could accept these sorts of epistemic principles. They could accept inference to the best explanation. They could accept these epistemic principles. They could accept the idea of making assessments of hypotheses in terms of explanatory virtues. I don't see why any of that has to presuppose anything about the external world. So it looks like here again we have an illustration of how you might reason your way out of external world skepticism. So I think if Rinard intends her argument to be merely illustrative of a possibility, well, it looks like we kind of already have examples of that. And maybe it's good to have another example. Sure, we have another example that we can put on the table, but I think that would somewhat reduce the significance of what she's done. So anyway, those were some thoughts about Rinard's paper, and I'm going to leave the video there. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Bye, everybody.